now, in getting us going, I'm very, very pleased and honoured to be able to welcome distinguished Professor Julian Thomas, who is the director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. Julian has had a long-standing impact on the field of media and communications in Australia, broadening, the depth of the questions we look at and really preparing the ground for us for an era in which the work that we do touches upon so many other domains and so many areas and aspects of life. And over the course of that work, Julian has written widely about digital inclusion, which is so critical for both of our countries, about automation and technologies such as Wi-Fi, of course, and the work on the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, which has run over a number of years and really is the kind of central kind of knowledge. Work on Internet on the Outstation and on work on remote Aboriginal communities has been really, really important in making the key arguments we need to make sure that the benefits of the digital are properly extended and respectfully structured in ways that work for all regions and all peoples in Australia. And Julian is joining us today, as I say, very much in demand everywhere, and so in a very busy schedule. So we're very grateful he's been able to make time for us to speak about society in the loop, observability, and the digital humanities for automation and AI. So thank you once more, Professor, and may I hand over the digital podium to you now.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Adrian. I hope everyone can hear me. And thank you for those very kind words. I'm really delighted to be able to join you for the workshop. Such an interesting and important set of questions as you laid out. So sincere thanks to you and Priya and the Institute for the opportunity to talk a little bit about our approach to these problems in our ARC Centre for Automated Decision Making in Society, as you mentioned, the research centre, which I am the director of at the moment. Now, I'm going to share some slides, if that's okay. So let me just do that, and please let me know if you can't see them. I'll do my best to get them up there. Right, we're halfway through them. Sorry, I'm going to take us right back to the beginning. Here we are. Can everybody see them? And you can hear me. Thank you.
Yes,
yeah. So I should also say You said I was busy. I would very much like to have more time to participate in the discussions you're having, and so apologies for not being able to stay longer. I also wanted to start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we work in our centre across Australia. And I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, Naarm, the traditional owners of the Wurundjeri people, as Priya said, the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and want to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I've included on this slide, I think, a painting which we have used and thought about quite a bit in our centre, the work of Triona Ham, a painting called Information Retrieval on Country, which is her reflection about her engagement with search engines and her thinking about the relationship between the kinds of knowledges and information produced by search engines and the sort of indigenous knowledges that are most closely linked to her country. Something we've been thinking about a lot in our centre. So the blue squares, those fuzzy blue shapes in that image, actually represent data overlaid onto the people and the landscape of the Eastern Kulin Nations. Okay, so what did I I guess I wanted to, take up some of the questions that Adrian's raised, and the challenge of the idea of intelligent futures and where the humanities might go in terms of engaging with them. So I wanted to share with you, I suppose, what I guess is one of the sort of central premises of our research in this space, which does very much come from a humanities and social science perspective. So we have come to the question of digital futures and intelligent futures via, I suppose, a bit of history, actually, which is where my original academic training is, in thinking about the long history of automation and the complex relationships between humans and machines. And I suppose our idea was that looking at what we are living through now with the emergence of the kinds of digital transformations that Adrian and Priya were talking about was actually something rather new, a new kind or a new mode of automation, speaking in general terms, of course. So if we think about the sorts of modes of automation, the kinds of machines we associate with the classical era of industrialization and really the first extraordinary phase of social science and philosophical thinking about automation going back to the 18th century, this was all about machines that were taking over the work of people and animals in terms of making things. So what we see now, which is, I think, a striking and important development, I say now, it's been going on for a while, but it's gathering pace, is the extraordinary proliferation of machines which are not just making things, but they're also making decisions. And this, I think, is a new kind of automation where in the past decisions were made by humans or through institutions. They're now being automated. And on that slide there, you can see a few examples of the kinds of decisions that automated systems are making for us in everyday life, from how we navigate from one part of the city to another, to the kinds of music that we might be listening to, our interactions with government. There's a few screenshots there from our Australian social security app provided by the Australian government, which very much controls the way in which people interact with government in order to receive social benefits and welfare. And also in health, and using the example there of the Google search engine and the way in which that shapes people's access to critical information. So this, we think, is something new. What makes it possible, of course, is the big data that our digital economy and digital social interactions now produce, the ubiquitous mobile connectivity, which many of us have, which give us, which generate, for example, data about where we are and what we might be doing. Of course, artificial intelligence and machine learning, which enables decision-making systems to draw on large volumes of that data and make predictions accordingly. And the big digital platforms, of course, which have the resources to bring all that together in cloud computing and huge data centers. So I suppose one thing we think is particularly significant, and I guess I've already hinted at this, but one thing that we think is really important, especially thinking about this from a human or social perspective, is that the kinds of debates that we're having about automation now and the sorts of digital futures we might look forward to have extended beyond those questions which we probably associate especially with the first wave of automation, which is the way in which machines are taking over the work of human beings, and with serious consequences, of course, for human communities. and people everywhere when people lose their jobs because of automation. But I suppose what we also, so we're seeing all that, of course, now, but we're also seeing something else, which is machines taking over the work of institutions, whether they're government bodies or indeed corporations with sets of policies or rules, or professional ethics or norms. So taking over that broad category of institutional controls. And from our point of view, that kind of automation then raises very critical issues of human oversight and control, which demand new kinds of analysis and investigation. We think that these demand a new kind of work which crosses the boundaries between the humanities, the social sciences, and the technological disciplines. So just to tell you a little bit then about our research centre, which was established in 2020 to address this new kind of automation. And you see there, I've set out our centre's mission as it appears on our website. And the first thing you'll see, of course, is that it's a complicated, multifaceted set of objectives for our centre. Really, so we're aiming to connect academic researchers with those in industry, government, and the community to develop responsible, ethical, and inclusive automated decision-making systems for the benefit of all Australians. So just to unpack that a tiny bit, in order to explain it, I don't want that to seem too cryptic. The centre is about making connections across sectors because we think that the sorts of problems that are raised by the kind of automated systems we're talking about can't be solved by any particular sector. They really need government, researchers, and the corporate sector and the not-for-profit sector to work together. We think that the sort of mode of automation that we're talking about now requires responsible, ethical, and inclusive solutions. So that means strategies, that means modes of automation where we are aware of and conscious of what their consequences may be. In just the same way, when we develop land in a way which affects the environment, we're required to develop an analysis of what impact our changes will have on the environment. We think it's just as important in this area of the digital economy and society that what we or corporations or governments do is also informed by an understanding of the likely consequences. We believe these sorts of new modes of automation also need to be framed in ethical ways. They need to be governed by rules, and they need to be inclusive. They need to be for the benefit of everybody. So we're aiming to do that, to enhance public understanding of these systems, which really are proliferating everywhere, inform public debate, and help train a new generation of researchers and practitioners for this challenge. And those people we see very much as not only academics or researchers working in research institutions, but also likely to be people working in government, the not-for-profit sector, and of course in business. We see these new automated systems as socio-technical in our sense. So we see them not as purely technological phenomena, not as things which are simply driven by technology or technological advances, but we see them as the result of interactions between the people who design them, who shape them, who often do a good deal of the work to generate the data sets that, for example, machine learning systems learn from. So the interactions of people, data sets also generated by technological systems and peoples. Institutions, as I've said, so governments or corporations or digital platforms which may develop and design these systems, and the machines themselves. So all of those things work together to create the kinds of systems that we're now seeing. You'll notice that we talk about automated decision-making, probably a bit more than we talk about AI as such. And that's because the kind of automation we're talking about, while it's now primarily driven by the advances in machine learning and now generative AI that we're familiar with, are not all associated with AI. Many of them are designed and built around other kinds of digital technologies. So just to tell you a tiny bit about the centre, it is a large centre in Australian terms, and for a centre which is primarily based in the humanities and the social sciences. It comprises 280 researchers from across 9 Australian universities. It's based at my institution, which is RMIT here in Melbourne, and it includes a network of industry partners and international research organisations. And there's a fair bit of information about what we're doing on our website if you're interested in taking a look at that. This complicated diagram, I apologise for, but it shows you broadly how the research program works, bringing people from a range of disciplines to look at those different strands of automation, the ones I mentioned, data, machines, institutions, and people, in order to develop new models for better practice, to reduce the risks of automation and encourage better outcomes. You'll notice that we have a set of focus areas: news and media, transport and mobilities, health and social services. That's because we think that the forms of automation and the new technologies we're interested in are really best understood in the context of particular sectors and industries, and that we have a lot to learn from understanding how they have developed in some of those spaces. And that includes drawing lessons from some of those to others. This whole area has become rather, as we would say, siloized. It's, a lot of the expertise is become very specific to particular areas like health or digital media. And so we try to break through those kinds of boundaries as well as the institutional ones. But the significant thing, I think, to say is that our centre is unusual as a large centre working in this area of AI and automation, which really is primarily based in the humanities and in the social sciences. So let me come to the core problem or the critical issue that I thought I would say a little bit about, and I think gives you a bit of a sense of the range of work that we do and the range of work, the questions that we think are particularly important if we're approaching these systems from the perspective of the humanities. And this is the question of observability, because we see that as critical, not only in terms of our capacity as humanities and social science scholars to understand automation better than we actually do. We need to be able to see what they are doing, what these systems are doing. We need to understand what they are doing. So observability is critical for that analytic objective, but it's also vital for that broader normative aim of improving public interest outcomes, of getting better results, so that our intelligent futures really do work for everybody. Observability is not a simple or straightforward matter. You'll probably all be aware that in all of the debates around how we regulate AI and so forth, we talk a lot about transparency and intelligibility, explainability, all of those kinds of features of technical systems. But we know that observability is rather more complicated than that. It is not just a matter of having a human overseeing or checking off the results of automated systems. It goes far more than that. It really is about our capacity to study these systems. It's not sufficient to answer all of our demands that we need to make of them, but it is critically important if we are going to assess them, if we're going to measure what they do, if we're going to evaluate them, if we're going to regulate them, if we are going to have human and social oversight over them. So that is what is critical for human agency, I think, in this space. That is what has been very difficult to achieve. That is what we have been working on. And we see it as both a research question and what I might call a kind of policy question. I really don't think we will get better outcomes from AI or automation unless we have a degree of independent observability. So observability from outside the platforms themselves or outside government, if we're talking about government services. So there are some critical questions that we can ask about these services. You know, to what degree can we ensure, if we have observability, can we ensure that our intelligent futures will be inclusive? To what extent can we have agency over and oversight over the new digital services? What questions can and should we be able to ask of them, and what questions should they answer? So let me just and I will try and move through these pretty quickly if you don't mind, but I thought I'd just to give you a flavour of the sort of work and why we think this question of observability and the related capabilities is so important, is I thought I'd have a look at three of our areas of work. One around the digital inequality issues, which Adrian's already mentioned. One around the observability of the media system, and especially advertising, and one about what we think we need to do next in our disciplines in order to scale up to meet the challenge of intelligent futures. So let me just sort of say a little bit quickly about a project of ours, which is about how we map and act upon digital inequalities in remote First Nations communities in Australia. And what is driving our work here is what is really a very significant agreement between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations in Australia and Australian governments at the national and at the state level. And this is what we call the Closing the Gap framework in the Australian context. And it has a number of critical outcomes. One of them is particularly important for the subject of the workshop today. This is what they call Closing the Gap Outcome 17. And you can see that it is about the imperative that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have access to information and services that enable them to make informed decisions about their own lives. So that is all about digital inclusion and their capacity to participate in the digital economy as they wish to do so, and to take advantage of the benefits of digital inclusion to the degree that they wish to do so. So this is what has framed our work, because when we saw that was there, we were aware that while this was a very important objective and one which is critical for the achievement of other critical goals in areas like health and education, there was no, at the time we started this work, there was no way of measuring progress towards it. So we did develop a research agenda in this space, developing formal partnerships with local First Nations organisations to support the research and the engagement in about 12 communities across Australia. We've been working with community co-researchers, employing them, and collaborating, of course, also with government agencies, industry, and a range of First Nations organisations. And the idea, of course, is that we return the data that we generate to the community, and that we work with the communities where we're working on the development of local digital inclusion plans and resource toolkits. So I'll just skip right to that. We've been doing this now for a few years, and we've started to get some sense of what we think is likely to be required in these communities if our intelligent futures are going to work for these communities and are going to include them in terms of the design and the priorities. So some of this is about how services are designed and paid for to make sure that they're affordable for low-income communities. Some of it is about making sure that the infrastructure... Sorry, just hearing a bit of background. Yeah, so some of it is about making sure the infrastructure is appropriate. Some of it is about making sure that that digital networks at a community level are designed in a way that gives the community some control over how they work. So, for example, there is a preference for Wi-Fi services in many remote communities because these can be turned off at night. I'll just move fairly quickly through. I know that we haven't got a lot more time, so I'll tell you a little bit about our work on advertising. This is important because the digital economy is very much driven by advertising, but there is, as you probably know, no visibility of advertising on digital platforms, no observability. How do we find out? So in the era of television and radio, in the era of billboard advertising, which of course we are still in our cities, we can see what's being advertised. But this is not the case on platforms like Facebook or others. And of course, advertising is and should be a regulated sort of set of industries. So, for example, in Australia, advertising alcohol on free-to-air on television is not done. Is illegal. But of course, we know that this happens in what we would call dark ads on digital platforms. So this project is about working with citizen scientists, as we call them, volunteers who use a plugin in their browser to download the ads that they view, and that enables us to pull all those ads together into an observatory where we can see what people are actually seeing. So we started this project back in 2021. Since then, as you can see, we've had almost 2,000 participants and built up a substantial database of ads. Now, this is actually very useful for a whole range of reasons. You can use it to understand how, for example, advertisers are making environmental claims. You can see the targeting of particular users in advertising for gambling, for alcohol, or for unhealthy foods. And you can see also how the platforms are explaining the kinds of ads that they see. I guess that's an example of the sorts of challenges of observability we see in the automated area. The future work we have to do in this space needs to go beyond just capturing what people see on a desktop browser to seeing what they find when they use their mobile devices, and the kind of sequencing of advertising. Also, of course, the emergence of generative AI, which is developing new ads tailored for individuals every time you click on a link. So advertising is absolutely essential to the digital economy, but it's something we don't see and don't know much about. This brings me to really the last example I wanted to use, but this is actually something different. It's really a plan for how we can go forward in our disciplines in terms of better understanding what's happening in the digital economy, recognizing the problems of observability and the need for new methods like the data donation methods we've used working with users to generate information about ads, understanding that that's probably some of the ways in which we're going to be working more in future. As we all know, the big digital platforms themselves are making it increasingly difficult for researchers from all disciplines to get access to critical information about how people are using it. So this new environment does present huge challenges for researchers right across the disciplines, but especially in key areas of the humanities and social sciences. It really needs a new set of tools, new set of skills, and certainly sort of, a new generation of data governance in order to deal with this. So what we're trying to do in our centre is work with another ARC centre in Australia, the Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child, which looks at children's experience of digital life, in order to build an ongoing set of capabilities and skills that can enable people to do the kind of work we've started to do, but at much less cost. So we're not reinventing the wheel every time we try to figure out what's going on a digital platform. The proposed, so we're calling this ASDO, or Australian Social Data Observatory, and it's I won't explain this in detail, but these are the critical elements of it. And we expect this new data observatory, which will include absolutely a whole range of data and information about people's interactions with digital platforms across a whole range of areas. So not just advertising, but also key information around, for example, the digital inclusion issues and other things like that I've been talking about, into a well-supported research facility that everybody can use, and we hope people from outside universities as well as within them. So I hope that gives you a good sense of the range of work we're doing and where we see this going. I do think that observability is a critical problem for us all as humanities and social science scholars addressing the challenges of intelligent futures. But I think there are some ways in which we're figuring out how to do it, and we think that we can get quite a bit further with these issues by working, and the way in which we do that is by working with communities, bringing society into the loop, as I said in the title, bringing community organisations, working with government and the private sector, and of course across our disciplines, in order to get an integrated understanding of these issues. So thanks very much, and I hope that's useful for your discussions.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was a really, really compelling and interesting oversight, not just of the issues that we face in Australia and the people that we're trying to help, but also kind of really practical ways about thinking about how we deal with the systemic implications of, data abundance that we often can't see or can't access. And when we can access it, how can we actually harness it into a set of mechanisms that allow, for the kind of considered and human approaches that we want to take, forward. So this kind of question of legibility, which I think in the Indian context, of course, there's Aadhaar, there's the world's biggest biometric program, which makes people legible in an incredible scale that's never been achieved. But then access to that data, is actually, very uneven in terms of who's able to find that data and use it usefully. Protection of that data is an issue. And of course, in India, when, Alphabet and Meta own 90% of the advertising market, which runs through WhatsApp on a huge scale, all those kind of questions about dark flows and what to do about them are very, very much live issues. So I think this kind of really sort of demonstrates how to think kind of systematically about such a huge kind of problem for everybody to solve. Now, I think we have a sort of 10 minutes, and perhaps we can have some questions for Julian before he leaves. Can I ask everybody to put their questions into chat in the first instance, and I will try and either I can pick some out from the chat box, unless you'd like to pick up on some yourself, Julian. So I can see there's one in here which is about, has any work been done with digital inclusion and exclusion with humanitarian entrance to Australia? So people who are coming into Australia on humanitarian visas, some of the most vulnerable populations, how can we help them in terms of getting to grips with the digital systems they'd have to learn to navigate to be part of Australian life, and the sort of risks that are also kind of inherent to this environment?
Absolutely great question. And as you say, people in those circumstances are extraordinarily vulnerable and face a serious set of challenges. We've been doing some work with the Red Cross, which is a partner organisation in our centre, about how we could do this work. We haven't done it ourselves yet. They have done some initial studies, and there is some work around. but very little that really does more than scratch the surface in terms of the Australian context. So thanks enormously for the question. And I think you're pointing to an area of work where much more is going to be required.
Thank you. So please, does anybody have their hand up? Or if you could
I can
type the
see,
question, that would be better.
Adrian, I can see a question from Vinesh.
Yes.
How do Indian researchers
ये सबसे बड़ी
become...
दिक्कत है ये एक्चुअली मेरे बारे
Sorry, can you mute, please? Thank you. Go on, Julie.
Okay, yeah, no, just how do Indian researchers become part of the ARC centres? So, I mean, I'll get down to specifics of our centre, but there are a number of ARC centres in Australia, and they do have. I mean, I think this is important. They do have. All of them have international partner research organisations, so it's possible for them to enter into collaborative arrangements with research organisations and indeed with other kinds of organisations outside Australia and in India. That is very possible to do so, and of course we are very interested in collaborating with organisations and researchers in India. I encourage people to get in touch with me if you'd like to talk about the work you're interested in doing, and I'd love to follow that up.
Thank you.
So, a little shy. I mean, I have lots of kind of questions around the legibility and the benefits of legibility, and trying to think about what connects to India, and not just in a very literal way. I mean, I think it's also, as I say to my students when I talk about Indigenous digital cultures, it's important to remember there are Indigenous people everywhere in the world. And so there are many groups in India, particularly Adivasi groups and others, who are also, contending, with systems designed for their benefit, but not designed necessarily with their knowledge. And how can you actually kind of include people in ways that speak to the needs of that community, and which are empowering and not just a kind of another sort of bureaucratic layer, which is a common legacy for both countries, of course. And how can you have a policy which kind of works against the urge to bureaucracy, because of the burdens of legibility. And the cost of maintaining access and compliance with these kind of systems, can be very heavy.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's just a really important and very challenging area. I think I'm sure that in Australia we can learn quite a bit from some of the initiatives and ideas around how that can be achieved in the Indian context. As you said, the Indian context is rather different, because in fact in India we have a far more advanced and integrated digital social service or government information system than we do in Australia. We talk about the Indian stack, of course, and that is something we do not have here, but we do also have in India, as we have here, as you said, the dominance of a small number of digital platforms, which really do virtually monopolize a great deal of communication, both at the community level in terms of media, news and information, and at the private level. And this is a whole domain which is very obscure, not only to researchers, but also, of course, to the users of these systems themselves, and to those civil society organisations, which are also well developed in India as well, I should say, that have an interest. So clearly, in India, there are well-developed arguments around, for example, the privacy questions, around the and of course around the regulation and moderation of content on those digital platforms. How do we get at those questions? as researchers, we think that perhaps just about the only way may be to work with people who use those platforms. So find ways where they can share the data that is generated through their interactions with those systems in a way which respects their privacy and preserves that, but enables us to develop a larger picture of what might be going on. So we're not just relying on, for example, on the digital platforms to tell us how well or not they're doing. We've got some independent view of that problem, so I suppose I think this is a really challenging problem for us as researchers. There is, it's very complex, but it's something we need to work on for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah. There's a question here from Professor Ranger who says, are there any initiatives as part of your of the ADM+S Centre's activities to develop cross-disciplinary courses at the master's level on these terrains? Because you talked about upskilling the future generation.
Yes, that's right. So, and thanks, Priya. Yes, so absolutely. So we're working on developing some graduate programs. We already do have some running, as we're a multi-university centre. So, of course, we have to work through our institutions to get academic programs like master's degrees happening. But we have made some progress on this, and I know. So, for example, in our QT, which is a participating institution, we've set up a master's program in this space, which has just commenced, and we've got some others happening. We're also running summer schools for graduate students, including coursework students from all over Australia every year, and people from overseas as well. So we'd really welcome if people know of any students who might be interested in participating in those. So that's where our students spend a week with our researchers and industry partners and others, working on specific problems and methods and tools, and also getting the chance to talk about their own work. Really encourage you to let people know about that if you think they may be interested in, and I can provide more information if people want that.
So that takes me to a final question, if you don't mind, Julian. I know you're pressed for time, but in both countries, of course, we have our eyes, fixed on the big transnational platforms, the platform giants, and how to manage them. India has clout because the sheer number of users, the importance of that data to those companies is very significant, and so issues around sovereignty and control and sort of the bilateral relationship. Australia, of course, has a different situation, but has kind of been a leader in regulating those platforms. But I think in terms of engaging with industry and working with industry on these very questions, rather than figuring industry as a inexhaustible, a user and abuser of data, but actually engaging with them to make progress in the areas. How has that experience been?
I think it's been really interesting, actually, Adrian. I mean, I've got a sort of strong view, I suppose, that unlike, some of our colleagues would not support working with industry. There's a view that the big tech companies in particular have a particular set of interests which to some people's minds are inconsistent with a independent research approach. I suppose our view has been that the complexity of this landscape is such that it is not really possible to do it from a great height. And we have to work in this space with those organisations which are running these services and doing those things in a way, of course, which doesn't prevent us from reaching our own conclusions about the consequences or ramifications of how particular services might be working, or what the problems might be in terms of data discrimination or bias or other things. We must be able to do that. But I suppose I have always thought that there is a great deal to be gained from keeping channels of communication open with technology companies. And that has certainly assisted us in understanding better the kinds of systems that we work with. So, for example, I mean, you know, I could give you quite a few examples, but in that area of digital inequality and remote communities, if we did not work or talk to the big telecommunications companies that provide critical digital infrastructure in those areas, we would not know what is feasible or possible, or what indeed are the obstacles to getting better results in those areas. We haven't really got everything we've asked for when we've talked to those companies, but we have understood a bit better why the problems are the way they are. And I think we've been able to exercise some influence in their thinking about what they could do differently. So that's one area. I mean, in terms of thinking about, say, the problems of bias in search engines, which are so significant because they're used all the time, and they're a critical source of information for people about really important things like health information, the example that I gave. So better understanding how search engines work, how they design this, how and why they design systems in the way they do, is really significant. It's got to be backed up by independent evaluation and analysis. And we think we can do that through that data donation method and some other approaches. But I mean, Google's never going to tell us what their search algorithm actually is, but by talking to them, or by people in Microsoft or elsewhere where people also run search engines, we can get a much better understanding of how they work and why we see some of the strange things we sometimes see, what they're trying to achieve. And I mean, for us, that's really, really informative. So yeah, it's a complicated problem, but I guess my sense is that, as I say, this is not work that we can do from an ivory tower. It's not work that we can do from a great distance. We need to talk to people if we can, work with them where possible, and also then do that to the degree that we can, also do that independent analysis and evaluation.
You know, that's really kind of helpful. I think, you know, I think my sense of it in those kind of encounters is that actually, you know, these companies also need some assistance. I mean, if you're going to operate in India on such a vast scale, how would you understand the consequences of what you're doing if you can't understand India? How can anybody understand India? It's so vast. If you don't have the kind of input from you know, from people like who are gathered here today, the same applies to Australia, to be able to kind of have input into the ways those platforms are managed and then get better outcomes. It's really impossible to expect engineers to be able to work this out a priori, you know, without the kind of input of this work. So, you know, in that sense, I think the work that I want to thank Professor Thomas now for his talk, but also to mention that the work that's being done here is exactly the kind of work that's going to influence the development of the next generation of algorithms and automated decision-making systems, so you can see directly, you know, how this kind of very pragmatic and humane approach can put knowledge out there, which can then be kind of taken into consideration in the design of those systems that will shape our intelligent futures. So it's a perfect case study, I think, in how you get yourself on a platform where you can actually start to make a difference in the design of these things. So I'd like to thank Julian for his talk, and of course him and all his colleagues for their work.